joining us now is Dr. Rasmus Nilsson, lecturer in post-Soviet politics and Russian foreign policy at the University College London. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for having me.
So with Moldova, the situation is partially comparable to that of Ukraine, but also it might be facing certain issues that Ukraine may not. Do you think the urgency that is there when it comes to Ukraine, the awareness that this process needs to be essentially completed at a fairly stable pace in order to allow Ukraine to gain the security benefits from joining the European Union, will it be there for Moldova as well? Or does Moldova run the risk of being one of those countries that are lost in this endless waiting room, like, for example, in the Balkans?
I think in the situation we are now, and with the geographical position that Moldova has, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that would be in anybody's interest. Obviously, as your presenter said earlier, quite rightly, both for Moldova and Ukraine, there are a number of hurdles to overcome before they can become, EU members. But I think, effectively shuttling Moldova a bit to the side would not work here, and there's no need for doing that either. I think what's really important in this process, what we've got to keep in mind, yes, of course, the countries, Moldova and Ukraine, have to fulfill a number of criteria in order to join the EU. But the main point here right now, the main thing that has to be stressed from the EU side is the positive story, the idea that these two countries belong ultimately inside the club, that there is a clear process in order to get there. And if it takes a few years, which it will do, then that's not a problem in itself, as long as both countries, and that includes Moldova as well, can see a trajectory that way. If you don't do that, if, say, Moldova became, as you indicated, a lost country, then there is a risk in the medium term of political instability in Moldova. There is a risk that those actors in Moldova who don't want to get closer to the EU can get more wind in their sails, and that's not going to help Moldova, that's not going to help anybody really.
And now we do see that, of course, now, like Ukraine, and there is a situation in Moldova, the prospect membership that poses similar questions to Ukraine, as now the Transnistria region is raising questions also about the fact that part of its territory now belongs to Russian influence as of now. Do you think that it might actually impact now the future accession?
Well, Transnistria, of course, has to be discussed, and although much less dramatically, so does the situation in Gagauzia in the south. Now, Transnistria as a de facto state is a separate issue, and it will become problematic. It's problematic now, it will be problematic in the negotiations going forward. However, we do have to remember, you indicated Russian influence in Transnistria, which is obviously quite right, but Transnistrian elites have their own interests as well, which I can assure you do not coincide with the Russian war in Ukraine. The Transnistrian elites would very much like access to broader markets, Romanian, European, and so on. And no, they're not ready to give up on everything in order to get that. They will want to negotiate fully, and there will be a Russian interest. But if you look over the coming years, what I would be doing as the EU would be trying to see, with Moldova, is there a way in which we can give the Transnistrians, they have to stay, they have to recognize that they're officially part of Moldova, but is there then a way in which we can give them some level of local autonomy, regional autonomy within Moldova, that can sort of get us over the hurdle that is Transnistria and the Transnistrian problem? I think the Transnistrian elites in the medium term would absolutely have an interest in doing that. They don't want to hitch themselves to any sort of Russian war wagon in the longer run. So if there's a way out for them within sovereign Moldova, then the EU should definitely pursue that.
Let's move on to the economic situation. Can you see the risk that skeptics might say, look, the European Union already has its own problems. It would be stretching itself thin if it allowed countries which do not satisfy the rather substantial economic criteria at the very start. They would say, we understand this is a political decision. Nevertheless, when other countries were beginning their negotiation processes, they had to go through all these criteria. So would you say that skeptics might try to derail the process by saying Moldova is not ready, and again force the European Union into this sort of slow burn where a country is waiting and waiting and waiting and not seeing any benefits, and ultimately beginning to wonder, okay, so is this process actually worth anything at all? I mean, it's happening in the Balkans already.
No, you're absolutely right, and skeptics will certainly try to do that. Russia will hint at it as well, for that matter. And this is why, again, I think it's really important that the EU, when it presents this story, when it talks about this story, when it engages with Moldova and with Ukraine in the years going forward, that the European Union, yes, of course, sticks to very strict economic criteria. It has to, that's the nature of the Union, and it should do so. But on the other hand, the EU also has to really emphasize this narrative, which was big in the 90s, early 2000s, that the EU ultimately is a success story. It is ultimately an identity project as well as an economic project. And if we can keep, and it is very important, you focused on that before, and I think you're right in doing so, it is very important that there is some consistent momentum in the process. The process may take long, but if Moldovans, if Ukrainians can consistently see, look, the EU do wonders, it might take a while, but there is a progress towards that aim. There is a recognition that we belong to the EU, we belong to the family. Then in the medium to longer term, I think you can overcome skeptics both inside the EU who want to wait a while and until Moldova and Ukraine are ready economically and so on, but also skeptics inside the countries. They need to constantly, Moldovans and Ukrainians, see that the EU is waiting there and wants to have them. As long as that takes place, as long as that narrative is preserved, then it is not a huge problem necessarily that it will take some years for Moldova and Ukraine to enter the EU.
And we're almost out of time, but one very quick question. What time frame could we be thinking about for Moldova?
We're talking about a number of years. I mean, I'm thinking everything can change quickly, of course, but I'm thinking 5-10 years at least. And we are talking, even though it's a small country, it's not going to come in without Ukraine, and the Ukrainian economy is, of course, a big issue. So we're talking that, but it all depends on what happens in the war with Russia.
Dr. Rasmus Nilsson was our guest today. Thank you so much for providing your expert insights.
Thank you.